June 7th, 1944. The beaches of Normandy had been secured just 24 hours earlier, and Allied forces were pushing inland through the hedgerows of northern France. What nobody expected was that one of the most critical moments of that first week wouldn't involve a seasoned soldier or a decorated officer. It would come down to a 16-year-old French student named Thomas Mercier, a dirt path through an apple orchard, and a decision that had to be made in less than 30 seconds. Before we dive into this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring you more fascinating stories from history. Thomas had lived his entire life in the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, a small farming community less than 3 kilometers from what the Americans were calling Omaha Beach. His father, Marcel, worked as a schoolteacher before the occupation. His mother, Colette, had grown up on the very farm where they now lived. For 4 years, they had watched German soldiers patrol their streets, requisition their crops, and turn their peaceful village into a fortified position. Thomas remembered the morning of June 6th with perfect clarity. He had been helping his mother collect eggs from the chicken coop when the sound started. At first, he thought it was thunder, but thunder didn't shake the ground like that. Thunder didn't make the water in the well ripple in concentric circles. By the time he ran to the window facing north, the sky was already dark with aircraft. Hundreds of them, more than he had ever seen in his life. His father had pulled him away from the window. "Stay inside," Marcel had said, his voice tight with fear and something else that Thomas would later recognize as hope. "Stay away from the windows. Whatever happens today, we stay inside and we stay quiet." But Thomas hadn't been able to stay away from the windows entirely. Throughout that long, terrifying day, he had caught glimpses of the battle unfolding on the distant beach, smoke rising in thick columns, the constant percussion of artillery fire that made his chest feel hollow, German soldiers running through the village, some heading toward the beach, others retreating. And then, as evening fell, the German soldiers were gone. Just gone. The ones who could retreat had done so. The ones who couldn't had surrendered or died. That night, the Mercier family had barely slept. They could hear American voices in the distance, speaking English that Thomas recognized from his studies but could barely understand through their accents. His father had taught him English before the war, insisting that education would be their resistance. Knowledge, Marcel would say, is the one thing they cannot requisition. By the morning of June 7th, American soldiers had reached Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. Thomas would never forget the first one he saw up close. A young man, maybe 22 or 23, with dirt on his face and exhaustion in his eyes. He had been carrying a rifle that looked too heavy for him, and when he saw Thomas staring from the doorway, he had smiled. It wasn't a big smile. Just a small one, tired but genuine. "You okay, kid?" the soldier had asked. Thomas had nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The soldier had reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. "Here," he said, tossing it to Thomas before moving on with his unit. That chocolate bar sat on the kitchen table for 2 days. Thomas couldn't bring himself to eat it. It felt like proof that something had changed, that maybe, finally, they could hope again. By the 3rd day after the invasion, a rhythm had established itself. American forces were pushing inland, but slowly. The hedgerows that made Normandy so beautiful also made it a nightmare to fight through. Every field was a potential ambush site. Every stone wall could hide a machine gun position. Thomas heard the soldiers talking about it when they stopped at the village well to fill their canteens. They spoke quickly, their words running together, but Thomas caught enough to understand. They were frustrated, scared, moving forward but paying a terrible price for every meter gained. That morning, Thomas had been sent by his mother to check on the apple orchard on the eastern edge of their property. The trees were old, planted by his grandfather, and several had been damaged by shelling. She wanted to know if any of the apples could still be harvested. The orchard sat on a slight hill giving a view of the surrounding countryside. To the east, Thomas could see the main road that ran from Saint-Laurent toward the town of Formigny, about 5 kilometers away. It was a good road, relatively straight, wide enough for vehicles. The Germans had used it constantly during the occupation. Now, Thomas could see a column of American tanks moving along it, heading east. Sherman tanks, he had learned they were called. Big, loud machines that made the ground shake as they passed. Thomas counted them. 12 tanks in the column, with soldiers walking alongside them. They were moving at a steady pace, not fast, but not slow either. Behind them, he could see supply trucks following at a distance. He was about to turn back toward the farmhouse when he saw something that made his breath catch. Movement in the tree line on the far side of the road, about half a kilometer ahead of the tank column. It was subtle, just a shifting of shadows, but Thomas had spent 4 years learning to notice things, learning to see what didn't belong. He squinted, wishing he had binoculars. The movement continued, dark shapes among the trees. Too many to be civilians, too coordinated to be animals. German soldiers. It had to be. An ambush position, waiting for the American tanks to roll into the kill zone. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the tank column, still moving steadily forward, completely unaware, then back at the tree line where the Germans were hiding. The Americans would reach that position in maybe 10 minutes at their current speed. His mind raced. He could run back to the farmhouse, tell his father, hope his father could somehow get word to the Americans. But that would take time. Too much time. The tanks would be in the ambush before anyone could warn them. He could do nothing, just watch. Stay safe. It wasn't his fight. He was 16 years old. What could he possibly do? But Thomas thought about that soldier who had given him the chocolate, about the tired smile, about the weight of hope that had settled over the village in the past 3 days. And he thought about what his father had always said. That courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was choosing to act despite it. There was an old path through the orchard. It had been there for decades, originally cut by his grandfather to move equipment between the fields. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a cart, but it ran almost parallel to the main road. More importantly, it cut across the open ground between the orchard and the road, emerging much closer to where the tank column was moving. Thomas made his decision in about 3 seconds. He jumped over the low stone wall that bordered the orchard and started running. The path was rough, uneven from years of use and recent shelling. Thomas had run it hundreds of times as a child, playing games with friends before the war. He knew every dip, every exposed root, every spot where the mud got slippery after rain. He used that knowledge now, pushing himself faster than he had ever run before. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. He could hear the rumble of the Sherman tanks growing louder as he ran, which meant he was getting closer. He could also hear something else, a sound that made his blood run cold. German voices, harsh commands being given in sharp whispers. They were closer than he had thought, much closer. Thomas burst out of the orchard path onto a small section of open ground about 200 meters ahead of the lead Sherman tank. He could see the commander standing in the turret hatch, scanning the road ahead. Thomas didn't think. He just reacted. He ran directly toward the tank, waving his arms over his head, shouting in his broken English. "Stop, stop, ambush, Germans." The tank commander saw him immediately. Thomas watched the man's hand move, signaling something to the tanks behind him. The column began to slow, but they weren't stopping. Not yet. They probably thought he was just a scared kid. Thomas kept running, kept shouting, "Ambush! Trees! Germans waiting!" He was about 50 meters from the lead tank when he heard a sharp crack. Then another, rifle fire from the tree line. The Germans had seen him. They knew their ambush was compromised, and now they were shooting at him. Thomas felt a bullet snap past his head so close he could hear the whip crack of it breaking the sound barrier. Another bullet kicked up dirt 3 meters to his left. He wanted to drop to the ground to make himself small, but he was too close now. If he stopped, the tanks might not understand. They might not realize. The tank commander finally understood. Thomas saw the man's eyes widen, saw him drop down into the turret and start shouting orders. The lead tank lurched to a halt, its turret beginning to traverse toward the tree line. The other tanks were stopping too, their commanders now alert to the danger. Thomas was 10 meters from the lead tank when his left leg simply stopped working. There was no pain at first, just a sudden inability to run. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his pants, just above his knee. Then the pain arrived, white-hot and all-consuming. He fell hard, his momentum carrying him forward in an ungainly tumble. The ground was harder than he remembered. Or maybe he was just softer. The world became sound and chaos. The Sherman tank's main gun fired with a concussive blast that Thomas felt in his chest. Other tanks were firing now, too, their machine guns raking the tree line where the Germans had been hiding. Return fire came from the trees, bullets sparking off the tank armor with sharp metallic pings. Someone grabbed Thomas by his jacket and dragged him. He tried to help, tried to use his good leg to push, but the pain in his wounded leg made everything go gray around the edges. He could hear an American voice close to his ear, saying something he couldn't quite make out. Then he was behind the lead tank, using its bulk as cover. A soldier was kneeling next to him, a medic by the look of the Red Cross on his helmet. The medic was cutting away Thomas's pant leg, exposing the wound. Thomas forced himself to look. The bullet had gone through the fleshy part of his thigh, missing the bone. The medic was already applying pressure, working with quick, efficient movements. "You're one crazy kid," the medic said, but Thomas heard the respect in his voice. "Crazy, brave kid." The firefight continued for another 10 minutes, but the outcome was never in doubt once the Shermans had opened fire. The Germans had been equipped for an ambush against vehicles they expected to be unaware and vulnerable. They weren't prepared to fight 12 Sherman tanks that knew exactly where they were. By the time the shooting stopped, 17 German soldiers had been killed and 9 captured. The Americans had suffered 3 wounded, including Thomas, but no fatalities. The tank column had been saved from rolling into a prepared kill zone that almost certainly would have resulted in multiple tank losses and numerous casualties. The tank commander, a captain from Pennsylvania named Robert Hayes, came to see Thomas while the medic was bandaging his leg. Hayes crouched down, looking Thomas in the eye. "What you did, son," Hayes said slowly, clearly, making sure Thomas understood. "That was the bravest thing I've seen in this whole damn war. You saved a lot of lives today. American lives." Thomas didn't know what to say. His leg hurt so badly he could barely think straight, but he managed to nod. "Thank you," he said in English. Hayes smiled. "No, son, thank you." They evacuated Thomas to a field hospital about 10 kilometers behind the lines. His parents found him there that evening, brought by an American jeep driver who had been sent specifically to fetch them. Colette cried when she saw him, holding his hand while a doctor explained that the wound was clean, that he would heal, that he might have a limp, but he would walk again. Marcel stood beside the cot, his hand on Thomas's shoulder. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The pride in his eyes said everything. Thomas spent 4 days in the field hospital before being transferred to a larger facility in Bayeux. During those 4 days, he had a steady stream of visitors, American soldiers who had heard the story, officers who wanted to shake his hand, a war correspondent who took his photograph and promised to send it to his newspaper in New York. Captain Hayes came to visit twice. The second time he brought something with him, a small wooden box containing a bronze star medal. It hadn't been officially approved yet, Hayes explained. The paperwork would take time, but Hayes wanted Thomas to have it anyway. "The Army doesn't usually give medals to French civilians," Hayes said, "but we're going to make an exception for you. What you did deserves recognition." Thomas looked at the medal, feeling its weight in his hand. It felt too heavy, too important for someone like him. "I just ran," he said quietly. "Anyone would have done the same." Hayes shook his head. "No, son. Most people would have frozen or run the other way. You ran toward danger to save people you didn't even know. That's not just courage, that's character." After the war, Thomas's story became one of those tales that circulated in military circles. The 16-year-old French kid who saved a Sherman tank column. Some of the details got exaggerated over time, as these stories often do. Some versions had him taking out German soldiers himself. Others had him being shot multiple times. But the core of the story remained true. Thomas himself rarely talked about it. He returned to school once his leg healed, finished his education, and eventually became a teacher like his father. He married a girl from the next village over, had 3 children, and lived a quiet life. The bronze star sat in a drawer in his study, wrapped in cloth, taken out only occasionally when his grandchildren asked to hear the story. But every year on June 7th, Thomas would walk out to the apple orchard on the eastern edge of the farm. He would stand there for a while, looking toward the road where those Sherman tanks had been rolling into an ambush, and he would think about that moment when he made his decision. That split second when a scared 16-year-old kid chose courage over safety. Years later, in an interview with a French historian, Thomas was asked if he ever regretted his decision. If the wound, the pain, the risk had been worth it. Thomas had thought about the question for a long moment before answering. "I think about those American soldiers sometimes," he said. "The ones who would have been in those tanks if I hadn't warned them. They went home. They had lives, families, careers, children who would never have been born if their fathers had died that day. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all because of 30 seconds where I ran instead of hid." He paused, looking out the window toward the orchard. How could I regret that? How could anyone regret that? The historian had asked one more question. What would Thomas say to young people today who wonder if they could be brave in a moment of crisis? Thomas's answer was simple. You don't know if you're brave until the moment comes. None of us do. But I learned something that day in the orchard. Courage isn't something you're born with. It's not something you either have or don't have. It's a choice you make when the moment demands it. And the thing about choices is that we all have the ability to make them. Every single one of us. The main road from Saint Laurent to Formigny is paved now, wider than it was in 1944. The hedgerows have been maintained, the fields are still farmed, and the apple orchard where Thomas made his decision still stands, now managed by his grandson. There's a small marker there, placed by American veterans who returned to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. It's a simple stone with a bronze plaque. On this site, June 7, 1944, Thomas Mercier, age 16, warned American forces of a German ambush, saving numerous lives at great personal risk. His courage exemplifies the spirit of the French resistance and the Allied cause. Every year, on the anniversary of D-Day, people still visit that marker. Veterans, historians, school groups learning about the war. And occasionally, they're joined by members of the Mercier family who maintain the orchard and keep the story alive. Because Thomas's story isn't just about one teenager's moment of courage, It's about all the moments like it that happened throughout the war. The countless times when ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, chose to act rather than to hide, chose others over themselves, chose courage over fear. Those Sherman tanks continued their advance after the ambush was neutralized. They fought through the hedgerows, participated in the breakout from Normandy, and some of them made it all the way to Germany by the war's end. The men in those tanks went home, just as Thomas had imagined. They had lives. They had stories of their own. And somewhere in those stories, in the memories passed down through their families, was the image of a French kid running toward danger, shouting warnings, saving lives. Thomas Mercier passed away in 2009 at the age of 81. His funeral in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer was attended by over 300 people, including 2 elderly American veterans who had been in that tank column in June 1944. They had flown from the United States specifically to pay their respects to the kid who saved their lives. At the funeral, one of them, a man named James Mitchell, who had been a gunner in the 3rd tank in the column, gave a brief eulogy. "I've had 65 years I wasn't supposed to have," Mitchell said, his voice shaking with emotion. 65 years with my wife, my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday morning when I woke up next to my wife. All of it was a gift from a 16-year-old kid who decided that warning a bunch of foreign soldiers was worth risking his life." Mitchell paused, looking at Thomas's children and grandchildren. "Your father, your grandfather, he didn't think he was a hero. I know that. He told me so years ago when I first came back to thank him. He said he just did what anyone would do, but that's not true. What he did was what heroes do. And because of that, I got to live a full life. We all did." The thing about Thomas Mercier's story is that it almost didn't happen. If he had hesitated for just a few more seconds, if he had convinced himself it wasn't his responsibility, if he had chosen safety over action, the outcome would have been very different. Those Sherman tanks would have rolled into that kill zone. Men would have died. Families back in America would have received telegrams that began with the words, "We regret to inform you." But that's not what happened, because one 16-year-old kid made a different choice. In the decades since World War II ended, historians have documented countless acts of heroism: soldiers who charged machine gun nests, pilots who flew impossible missions, sailors who kept their ships afloat through sheer determination. And every one of those stories is important. Every one of those acts of courage deserves to be remembered. But there's something particularly powerful about Thomas's story. Maybe it's because he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for combat or prepared for war. He was just a kid who found himself in a moment where doing nothing was easier than doing something, where safety was available if he just turned around and walked away, and he chose the harder path. He chose action. That choice echoes forward through time, through the lives of the soldiers he saved, through their children and grandchildren, through every person whose existence traces back to that moment when Thomas Mercier decided to run toward danger instead of away from it. The shortcut through the orchard is still there. Thomas's grandson maintains it, keeping it clear and passable. He says it's important to preserve it, not just as a historical site, but as a reminder that the paths we choose matter, that the shortcuts we take, the risks we accept, the moments we choose courage over fear, they ripple outward in ways we can never fully measure. On clear days, if you walk that path through the orchard, you can still see the main road where the Sherman tanks were rolling. The view hasn't changed much. The trees are taller now, the fields better maintained, but the essential geography remains the same. And if you stand there long enough, if you let your imagination work, you can almost see it. A 16-year-old kid running faster than he ever thought possible, lungs burning, legs pumping, racing against time to save lives he would never live to see fully flourish. That's the real story of Thomas Mercier. Not just that he saved a tank column, but that he showed us something essential about human nature, about the capacity we all have for courage when the moment demands it, about the choice that exists in every crisis between doing the easy thing and doing the right thing. Thomas made his choice in the apple orchard on June 7, 1944. And because of that choice, 12 Sherman tanks kept rolling, soldiers kept fighting, the war kept moving forward. And when it finally ended, those soldiers went home to lives they almost didn't have, carrying with them the memory of a French kid who proved that heroism isn't about rank or training or preparation. It's about character. It's about choice. It's about being willing to run toward danger when every instinct screams at you to run away. That's a lesson worth remembering in 1944 and today. And for as long as people tell stories about courage, sacrifice, and the extraordinary things ordinary people can do when faced with extraordinary moments. The apple trees in the Mercier orchard still produce fruit every year. They're old now, some of them dating back to before the war, gnarled and twisted, but still productive. Thomas's family still harvests them, still makes cider and calvados from the apples. still tends the land that has been in their family for generations. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right through those old trees, you can almost hear it. The sound of a 16-year-old kid running for his life, running toward danger, running toward history, making a choice that would echo through generations. That's how one teenager's insane shortcut saved a Sherman tank column from ambush. Not through supernatural intervention or impossible heroics, just through courage, just through choice, just through the simple, profound act of deciding that other people's lives mattered more than his own safety. And in the end, isn't that what all the great stories of World War II come down to? People making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. People choosing others over themselves. People proving that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Thomas Mercier understood that. At 16 years old, in an apple orchard in Normandy with German bullets flying and American tanks rolling toward disaster, he understood it in a way that most people never will. And because he understood it, because he acted on it, 12 tanks kept rolling. Dozens of soldiers kept living. And the world became just a little bit better because one kid decided to take a shortcut through an orchard and warn strangers about danger they couldn't see coming. That's not just a war story. That's a human story. And it's one worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through the generations. Because the world needs more Thomas Merciers. It always has. It always will. The recovery process for Thomas was longer and more difficult than anyone initially expected. The bullet wound itself had been clean, but infection was a constant threat in field hospitals during the war. Antibiotics were precious and reserved primarily for combat troops. Thomas spent weeks in medical facilities, first in Bayeux, then in a converted chateau near Caen that had been turned into a recovery ward. During those weeks, Thomas had time to think about what he had done. In the immediate aftermath, running on adrenaline and shock, he hadn't fully processed the reality of it, but lying in a hospital bed with nothing to do but heal and reflect, the weight of it settled on him. He had almost died. The bullet that hit his leg had been one of several that missed him by centimeters. Any one of them could have hit something vital. He could have bled out in that field before the medic reached him. His mother visited every day that she could manage the journey. She would sit beside his bed, holding his hand, not saying much. Sometimes she cried quietly. Other times she would tell him news from the village, who had returned to their homes, what buildings had been damaged, how the Americans were helping with repairs. Small, ordinary things that felt impossibly precious after years of occupation. His father came less frequently, but stayed longer when he did. Marcel would bring books, reading to Thomas in the evenings when the ward was quiet. They worked through old French novels, poetry, anything Marcel could find. But sometimes they would just talk about the war, about what came next, about the future that was suddenly, impossibly within reach again. One evening, about 3 weeks after the incident, Marcel set down the book he had been reading and looked at his son directly. "I need to tell you something," Marcel said. "I need you to understand that what you did was incredibly brave, but it was also incredibly dangerous. And as your father, I am both proud and terrified in equal measure." Thomas nodded slowly. "I know, Papa. I was terrified too." Marcel smiled slightly. "Good. Fear is what keeps us alive. It's what tells us when we're in danger. The trick is knowing when to listen to it and when to ignore it." "How do you know the difference?" Thomas asked. Marcel thought for a long moment. "I think you ask yourself what matters more, your safety or someone else's life. And if the answer is someone else's life, then you ignore the fear and you act. That's what you did. You decided that those American soldiers mattered more than your safety." "But what if I had died?" Thomas said quietly. "What if I had left you and Mama alone?" Marcel reached out and gripped Thomas's shoulder. "Then we would have grieved. We would have mourned. But we also would have been proud, because you would have died doing something that mattered, something that had meaning. The worst death, Thomas, is a meaningless one. You made sure that if you died, it would mean something." The conversation stayed with Thomas long after his father left that evening. It helped him process what he had done, helped him understand that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being afraid, choosing to act anyway. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to walk again, first with crutches, then with a cane, eventually on his own. The limp that the doctor had predicted became reality. His left leg would always be slightly weaker, would always remind him of that day in the orchard. But he could walk. He could run if he needed to, though not as fast as before, and he was alive. The war continued around them. Thomas followed its progress through newspapers that American soldiers would bring to the hospital, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris in August, the push toward Germany. Each victory felt personal now. Every advance meant that his actions, his decision to run into danger, had contributed to something larger than himself. In September, Thomas was finally discharged from medical care. He returned home to Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer to find the village transformed. American engineers had been through, clearing unexploded ordnance and repairing damaged buildings. The church steeple, which had been knocked down by artillery fire during the initial invasion, was being rebuilt. Fields that had been torn apart by combat were being prepared for planting again. Life was returning to normal, or at least to a new kind of normal. One without German soldiers on the streets, one where people could speak freely again, where children could play without fear, where the future felt possible again. Thomas returned to school that fall, though he had missed months of instruction. His teachers were understanding, offering extra help to get him caught up. His classmates treated him differently now, some with awe, some with awkwardness, not sure how to talk to someone who had done something so extraordinary, a few with jealousy, though they tried to hide it. Thomas didn't want to be treated differently. He wanted to be just another student, working toward his exams, planning for the future. But he understood that he couldn't go back to being the person he had been before June 7th. That version of Thomas had died in the orchard, replaced by someone who understood violence and sacrifice in ways that most 16-year-olds never would. His best friend before the war, a boy named Luke, was one of the few who treated him the same as always. They would walk home from school together, Thomas limping slightly, Luke matching his pace without comment. They talked about ordinary things, football, girls, what they wanted to do after the war ended, normal teenage conversations that felt like a gift after years of occupation. One day, about a month after Thomas returned to school, Luke asked him the question that everyone seemed to want to ask, but rarely did. Were you scared when you were running toward the tanks? Thomas thought about lying, about saying no, that he had been too focused on warning the Americans to be scared. But Luke deserved the truth. I was terrified, Thomas said, the whole time. Even before the shooting started, I kept thinking that I should turn back, that this was insane, that I was going to die for nothing. But you didn't turn back, Luke said. No, I don't know why. I just kept running. I think maybe I was more scared of living with myself if I did nothing than I was of dying. Luke nodded slowly. I don't know if I could have done that. I want to think I could. But I don't know. I didn't know either, Thomas said. Not until the moment came. Maybe that's the point. You don't know what you'll do until you have to decide. The conversation stayed with both of them. Years later, Luke would tell Thomas that it had changed how he thought about courage, that it had helped him make his own difficult decisions when the time came. Winter arrived, cold and harsh. Food was still scarce, though better than it had been during the occupation. The Americans provided supplies, but rationing continued. Thomas's family survived on what they could grow and what they could receive through aid programs. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Thomas used the winter months to catch up on his studies. He discovered that he had developed a new appreciation for education. Before the war, before his injury, school had sometimes felt like an obligation. Now it felt like a privilege. Every day in a classroom was a day of peace. Every book was a reminder that civilization still existed, that knowledge still mattered, that there was more to life than violence and survival. His English improved dramatically. He practiced with American soldiers who were stationed near the village through the winter. They were happy to talk with him, word of his actions having spread through the military units in the area. Some wanted to hear the story directly from him. Others just wanted to help a kid who had helped them. One soldier, a sergeant from Boston named Patrick O'Brien, took a particular interest in Thomas's education. O'Brien had been a teacher before the war and found himself drawn to Thomas's determination to learn. They would meet twice a week when O'Brien's duties allowed, working through English grammar and vocabulary. You've got talent for this, O'Brien would say. You could study in America after the war if you wanted. Plenty of schools would be happy to have you. War hero and all that. Thomas would shake his head. This is my home. My family is here. After everything, I can't imagine leaving. O'Brien understood. He had seen enough of war to know that sometimes the bravest thing was staying and rebuilding rather than running to somewhere new. Spring arrived in 1945 with news that seemed too good to be true. The war in Europe was ending. German forces were collapsing on all fronts. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime was finished. And then, on May 8th, it was official. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer erupted in celebration. People poured into the streets, embracing, crying, laughing. The church bells rang for the first time in years, their sound carrying across the fields and orchards. American soldiers celebrated alongside French civilians, barriers of language and culture dissolving in shared joy. Thomas stood in the village square with his family, watching the celebration unfold around them. His mother was crying, clutching both Thomas and Marcel. His father stood straight and tall, tears streaming down his face but smiling wider than Thomas had seen in years. It's over, Colette kept saying. It's really over. Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, joy at the victory, but also sadness for everything that had been lost. For for the friends who hadn't survived the occupation, for the years of childhood stolen by war, for the innocence that could never be recovered. But mostly he felt hope. For the first time in his life, the future felt open and unlimited. Anything seemed possible. They could rebuild. They could heal. They could live without fear. The summer of 1945 was unlike any Thomas had experienced. The village came together to repair what had been damaged, to plant crops in fields that had been battlegrounds, to restore homes that had been occupied or destroyed. American soldiers helped with the reconstruction efforts before beginning their gradual withdrawal. The Marshall Plan was announced, promising aid for European recovery. Thomas spent the summer working on the family farm, helping with the harvest. His leg had healed as much as it was going to. The limp remained more pronounced when he was tired, but manageable. He could work a full day in the fields, though his father and mother always watched him closely, ready to insist he rest if they thought he was pushing too hard. In August, Thomas received a letter that changed everything. It was from the United States Army, official and formal. They were officially awarding him the Bronze Star for his actions on June 7, 1944. There would be a ceremony in Paris. His family was invited. Captain Hayes would be there to present the medal personally. The ceremony took place on a warm September day at the American Embassy in Paris. Thomas wore the nicest clothes he owned, feeling awkward and out of place among the military officials and diplomats. His parents stood beside him, equally uncomfortable but fiercely proud. Captain Hayes looked different in his dress uniform, cleaner and more formal than Thomas remembered from the field. But when he smiled at Thomas, it was the same tired, genuine smile from that day in June. The ceremony was brief but moving. Hayes spoke about Thomas's actions, about the lives saved, about the courage of the French people during the occupation. When he pinned the Bronze Star to Thomas's jacket, he whispered something that only Thomas could hear. "You gave me a future, kid. Don't ever forget that." Thomas didn't trust himself to speak. He just nodded, feeling the weight of the medal on his chest. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Thomas met other soldiers he had saved, men whose names he had never known, but whose faces he recognized. They shook his hand, thanked him, shared stories about what they had done since the war ended. One was engaged to be married. Another had started college. A third had returned to his family's farm in Iowa. Each conversation was a reminder of the ripple effects of that single decision in the orchard. These men had futures because Thomas had run toward danger instead of away from it, and those futures would create more futures. Children who would be born, businesses that would be started, lives that would be lived fully because Thomas had chosen courage over safety. The experience was overwhelming. Thomas found himself stepping outside onto a balcony, needing air and space to process it all. His father found him there a few minutes later. "It's a lot," Marcel said simply. Thomas nodded. "I keep thinking about how close it was. If I had hesitated even a few more seconds, if I had been a slower runner, if the Germans had been better shots." "But those things didn't happen," Marcel said. "You didn't hesitate. You were fast enough, and you're here now. That's what matters." They stood in silence for a while, looking out over Paris. The city was recovering too, showing signs of life and hope after years of occupation. "What do I do now?" Thomas asked. "How do I live up to this?" Marcel put his hand on his son's shoulder. "You don't live up to it. You just live. You take the future you helped create and you do something meaningful with it. You become the person you want to be. That's all any of us can do." Thomas returned to school that fall with a new sense of purpose. He threw himself into his studies with intensity, determined to make the most of the education he had been given. He excelled in languages, in literature, in history. His teachers recognized his potential and encouraged him to think about university. The idea seemed impossible at first. University was for wealthy families, for people with connections, not for the son of a village schoolteacher and a farmer's daughter. But post-war France was changing. Opportunities were opening up that hadn't existed before. And Thomas's story, his Bronze Star, his connection to the liberation, opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. In the spring of 1946, Thomas received a letter of acceptance to the Sorbonne in Paris. He would study literature and education, following in his father's footsteps, but in ways his father had never been able to. The scholarship covered his tuition. The French government, in recognition of his service, provided a small stipend for living expenses. Leaving Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer was harder than Thomas expected. The village had been his entire world for 16 years. Even during the war, even during the occupation, it had been home. Paris felt impossibly large and intimidating. But his parents encouraged him, insisting that this was his chance to build the future he deserved. University life was challenging but rewarding. Thomas found himself surrounded by other students who had lived through the war, who had their own stories of resistance and survival. They understood each other in ways that created deep bonds. They didn't talk much about the war itself, preferring to focus on the future they were building, but the shared experience was always there, underlying everything. Thomas met Isabel in his second year at university. She was studying mathematics, brilliant and determined, with ambitions to become a professor. They met in a cafe near the Sorbonne, both reaching for the same newspaper at the same time. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. They discovered shared interests, shared values, shared hopes for the future. Isabel knew about Thomas's war experience. Everyone did. The story had been covered in newspapers, celebrated as an example of French resistance, but she didn't treat him like a hero. She treated him like a person, someone with strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears, dreams and doubts. It was exactly what Thomas needed. They were married in the summer of 1949 in the church in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer that had been rebuilt after the war. American veterans who had been in that tank column sent congratulations letters. Captain Hayes sent a telegram wishing them happiness and long life. The village celebrated as they had learned to celebrate in peacetime, with food and wine and music and joy. Thomas graduated from the Sorbonne in 1950 and returned to Normandy to teach. Not in Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, which was too small to need another teacher, but in Bayeux, where the schools were rebuilding and expanding. He taught literature and English, passing on the education he had fought to preserve during the war. Isabel found work as a mathematics instructor at the same school. They bought a small house on the outskirts of Bayeux, close enough to visit Thomas's parents regularly, but far enough to build their own life. They had their first child, a daughter they named Marie, in 1951. A son, Jean, followed in 1953. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost miraculous after years of chaos. Thomas would wake early, walk to school despite his limp, teach his classes, return home to his family. Simple, ordinary, peaceful, everything the war had tried to deny them. But Thomas never forgot the orchard. Every June 7th, he would drive to Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer and walk that old path through the apple trees, sometimes alone, sometimes with Isabel, later with his children. He would stand at the spot where he had emerged onto the road, where he had seen those Sherman tanks rolling toward disaster, and he would remember. He would remember the fear, the sound of bullets, the pain of being shot, but mostly he would remember the decision. That moment when he chose action over safety, when he decided that other people's lives mattered more than his own fear. Years later, when his grandchildren asked him about the war, about his medal, about the tanks, Thomas would tell them the truth, that he had been terrified, that he had acted anyway, that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and choosing to do the right thing despite the fear. And then he would tell them something else, something he had learned over the decades since that day in June. That moment in the orchard, he would say, it taught me that we're all capable of more than we think, that in our worst moments, in our most frightening moments, we have the capacity to be extraordinary, not because we're special, but because we're human. And being human means having the ability to choose courage when it matters most. The grandchildren would listen, wide-eyed, trying to imagine their grandfather as a 16-year-old kid running through an apple orchard with bullets flying around him. It seemed impossible. Their grandfather was just their grandfather, gray-haired and limping, gentle and patient, always ready with a story or a laugh. But he had been that kid once, and that kid, in a moment that lasted less than 2 minutes, had changed the course of lives he would never meet, had created futures that spread out like ripples on water, touching generations yet to be born. That was the real legacy of Thomas Mercier. Not the medal or the newspaper articles or the ceremonies, but the lives, the futures, the children and grandchildren of the men he saved, the students he taught, the family he raised, the example he set. A single act of courage in an apple orchard, performed by a terrified teenager who chose action over safety, had echoed forward through time in ways that could never be fully measured or understood. But it was real. It mattered. And it would continue to matter as long as people told the story. Because in the end, that's what stories like this teach us, that our choices matter, that our actions have weight, that even in our most ordinary moments we have the capacity for extraordinary courage, that the future is created not by grand gestures or epic battles, but by the small, profound decisions we make when faced with impossible choices. Thomas Mercier made his choice in June 1944, and the world is better because he made it.